So there is a spider in the corner of my bedroom ceiling, just above my reading lamp. Maybe I should remove her and her sticky, webby home too. I do realize it's generally considered to be a sign of bad housekeeping to keep spiders in one's home, but I let my spiders stay because honestly, every mosquito she catches in her web means one less nighttime bite for me. And she is a prolific mosquito catcher, my spider. She's a good roommate, if a bit messy. Also, my spider provides me with a frequent reminder of something I am trying to cultivate in my own life, and that's patience. I confess I would not have made the connection between patience and spiders without the help of a young friend, a member of our children's choir, so I would like to give her credit for the insight. During our music camp, we were singing, "I've got peace like a river," which also has verses, "I've got love like an ocean, and I've got joy like a fountain in my soul." And we invited the kids to think of their own metaphors for the other fruits of the Spirit. Now, this clever girl came up with patience like a spider. And while I admit that singing the line, "I've got patience like a spider in my soul," gives me the creepy crawlies, I still love the metaphor. I asked my young friend what exactly it was about a spider that reminded her of patience, and she said, "A spider has to sit there and wait for its food." This is true. No instant gratification for a spider, no DoorDash with guaranteed half-hour delivery. A spider must be very patient indeed as it waits, motionless, for its food to land. But patience does not imply passivity. Before settling in for the long wait, the spider must construct the intricate web, one filament at a time, an impressive act of patience in itself. That preparation is the prerequisite for the patience, for without the web, no amount of waiting will bring forth the dinner. And then the disappointment when someone, probably a better housekeeper than I am, comes along with a Webster and demolishes the whole thing. Back to square one, starting the process again. Patience is a process and one that must be repeated. Now, I'm not sure how much thought Jesus ever gave to spiders, but if he had, I'm pretty sure he would have incorporated them into his teachings. They're the perfect object lesson for the virtue of patience. As it is, Jesus used other metaphors to plant the seeds of the spiritual fruit, because he knew his followers were not going to have the instant gratification of watching the kingdom of God spring up overnight like a brand new Dollar General store. If they were going to continue the work of building God's kingdom here on earth, they would need so much patience. The kingdom of God is like yeast, Jesus told them. You ever make bread? It's a slow process, especially when you do it the old-fashioned way with natural leavening, which is how bread was always made before the modern invention of packaged yeast. First, you got to make the starter. That in itself is a process that lasts for days as the natural yeast from the air get into the dough and begin to ferment. And you've got to coddle this little ball of newborn yeastiness, splitting it and feeding it new flour every day until it's ready for action. And then you get to make the bread. And that loaf is going to need lots of time to rise, as natural leavening is a slow process. But meanwhile, you got to fire up your brick oven. We won't even go into how much time it took to make that oven and each handmade brick. But even with the oven already made, bringing it to the right bread baking temperature, well, it can take 24 hours, plus the time required to gather the wood or dung or whatever made the fire, all of that to get a loaf of bread. So the kingdom of God being like yeast, well, we see that building this kingdom is a serious exercise in patience. And as we have just acknowledged, yeast is only one component of the bread. Kind of makes the spider's meal look like fast food. But God's sense of time is different from ours. With God, a day is like 1,000 years, wrote one first-century theologian. And the ancient Hebrew wisdom writer wrote with great optimism that God makes everything beautiful in God's own time. So buckle up, folks. We are in this thing for the long haul. I'm not so sure Jesus' followers realized the temporal scope of the project they were undertaking, but I do hope that 2,000 years later, we do. This kingdom of God thing, it hasn't really taken the shape that it might have, has it? We look around for evidence of shalom, and instead we see disturbing inequality and shocking injustice, egregious acts of violence and escalating tension, and we can choose to react in one of two ways. We can give into despair, or we can cultivate the spiritual fruit of patience. Now, the better choice is obvious, patience, of course, but what might not be obvious is this. Patience does not equal passivity. Patience is a practice requiring some effort on our part. Patience does not mean sitting down and waiting for Jesus to come and fix the problems. Patience does not mean resigning ourselves to some vague idea that God has a plan and every terrible thing that happens must be part of it. Patience does not mean letting go and letting God, because guess what? God works through us. Patience is the baker taking the time to nurture the starter, knead the dough, and wait for it to rise, not staring at a bin of flour and waiting for bread. Patience is the spider weaving the web, not just gazing longingly at every flying feast. As Tom Petty used to sing, the waiting is the hardest part, but it's not so bad if there's something for which to wait, which is why Jesus threw down so many seeds, teaching as many people as he could. This is what the kingdom of God looks like. He knew he would not live to enjoy the heaven on earth that he knew was possible. Still, he showed his followers how to plant the garden. Jesus might never taste the fruit of the vine he was growing, yet he labored patiently to cultivate it. He came from a long line of planters who knew that patience meant doing the work, even if they would not live to enjoy the result. Moses led his people out of enslavement in Egypt, but he never set foot in the promised land. Abraham and Sarah waited a lifetime for the birth of their child, but never saw the many grandchildren and great-grandchildren who would teach even more generations about their God. Yet all of them lived lives of patient perseverance, actively planting seeds that would grow to nourish many. And we are heirs to these heirloom seeds and to the gardens in which they grow. It does seem slow growing, but that is not because God takes some cruel delight in testing our patience. It's more that we, humanity collectively speaking, we haven't always persevered with the practices that will bring about the results we long for. The day-to-day work of building God's kingdom requires patience in spades, but not the sitting under the oak tree kind of patience. The patience we need is that of a gardener coming back every day to weed and water and fertilize and prune, even if they won't see immediate results. The Indian poet-philosopher Rabindranath Tagore once wrote, "The one who plants trees, knowing that he will never sit in their shade, has at least started to understand the meaning of life." One of my personal heroes, the pastor whose ministry first inspired me to listen to God's call in my life, was the Reverend Ellen Rowan, who affirmed the belovedness of the LGBTQIA+ community when it was unpopular and even dangerous to do so. She was so committed to full inclusivity that she stood alongside more than 90 clergy persons to preside over a same-sex union back in the 90s, when they all could have had their orders revoked for doing so. They were not disciplined. The church could simply not punish so many pastors at one time without facing a serious shortage of clergy. And yet the denominational ban against same-sex marriage, which was in place only since 1984, by the way, that was not lifted until just this year. It took 40 years for the church to remove this language of discrimination, and 50 years to remove some slightly older homophobic language from our book of discipline. Yet Pastor Ellen and others like her worked patiently to move the church in the direction of love. I lament that my dear pastor never lived to see the fruit of her labor. She died just 11 months before this happened. Yet just recently, I had the joy of meeting another clergywoman who, also part of the LGBTQIA+ community, had been defrocked in the 1990s. She had had to retool for a new career and a new life outside pastoral ministry. It was beyond painful. But just weeks ago, she had her orders reinstated in a public ceremony of reconciliation. She did not have to accept the church's apology for their treatment of her. Some wondered how she could. But she decided that no matter how she had been treated, she would model grace. Even after 3 decades of rejection, she accepted the embrace of welcome. After all, many had worked tirelessly to bring her back into the fold. After hearing her story, I hugged my new friend, and remembering my old friend, Pastor Ellen, I thought, this is what decades of patient perseverance feels like. The teachings of Jesus promise us that we can indeed experience what he called abundant life, full connection with God and with each other. This is the life that God dreams of for us, a life in which there is no exclusion, only loving shalom. Is this what we want? If so, then we must cultivate the spiritual fruit of patience, a tedious fruit indeed, but one we cannot afford to disregard. Patience is an essential ingredient in the spiritual evolution and revolution called the kingdom of God. As Paul wrote to the faith community in Galatia, so let us not grow weary in doing what is right, for we will reap at harvest time if we do not give up. May the seeds of patience grow in us too. I would send you forth with this blessing, a musical tribute to patience. May you run and not be weary, may your heart be filled with song, and may the love of God continue to give you hope and keep you strong, and may you run and not be weary, may your life be filled with joy, and may the road you travel always lead you home. Thanks be to God for you, dear friends.